In the tissues unit, we will be looking at the 4 major types of tissues. These include epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. We're going to start out with epithelial tissues. Another word for epithelial tissue is epithelium. These are going to consist of tightly packed cells that form a continuous layer. Primarily, they function to protect. They protect underlying structures, but they can also have structures in them that are involved for secreting substances or absorbing substances, as well as excretion and filtration. One characteristic of epithelial tissue is a basement membrane. And the basement membrane is the layer that joins the epithelium to the underlying connective tissues. On the surface, epithelial tissue protects the body from injury, protects it from drying out, preventing water loss, and by possible invasion of microbes such as bacteria and viruses. So epithelial tissue in this way, such as the kind that makes up your skin, actually works as part of your immune system. Internally, epithelial tissue is used to secrete mucus along the digestive tract and to sweep up impurities from the lungs by means of cilia. And if you look at this microscopic image, what we see is the surface of the cells here, and then on top of that we see these hair-like projections, and this is the cilia that we're referring to. These will sweep back and forth to brush pieces of mucus or little tiny food particles and so forth out of the trachea. So if you've ever gotten a little tickle in your throat, you had to clear your throat or cough, it's because something has landed on these cilia and the cilia that line your trachea, your windpipe, and they begin to beat back and forth to push that out. Also, some epithelial tissue that is used to absorb molecules may have extensions called microvilli. And microvilli function to increase the absorptive surface area of the cell surface. So if this is the top of our cell surface, but if it was just flat like that, we don't have a lot of surface area. But if we have it to where it is looped back and forth, these like finger-like projections coming off the top, we fit a lot more surface area into the same amount of space as we would if it were just flat. So microvilli increase the absorptive surface area on the surface of cells. Classification for epithelial tissue is according to the shape of the cell as well as the number of layers of tissue. So I'm going to attempt to draw some of these very quickly, and then we'll go through them more in depth. But for cell shapes, squamous is just kind of roundy, flat looking, okay, nucleus. Cuboidal, just like it sounds, it's shaped like a cube. Nucleus. Columnar, just like it sounds, like a column. I'm trying to draw these kind of 3D here with a nucleus. So you have squamous, which are flattened, kind of round, and then cuboidal, which is more 3D, like a cube, and then columnar, which is more 3D, like a column. They're also characterized by the layers of tissue. Simple would mean that there is one layer. Stratified would mean that there's more than one layer, and pseudostratified looks like there's more than one layer, but actually every cell touches the basement membrane, so it's actually just one layer. So we'll look at an example of that in just a minute. So to begin, squamous epithelial is characterized by flattened cells and is found lining the lungs and blood vessels. This type of epithelial tissue is flat, very thin, so that diffusion can take place across it. And we need diffusion in the lungs and the blood vessels, diffusion of oxygen and diffusion of carbon dioxide. Cuboidal contains cube-shaped cells, and these line the kidney tubules, so for absorption. Columnar has cells resembling pillars or columns. Nuclei are most often found near the bottom, and this lines the digestive tract. Some types of columnar epithelial tissue can be ciliated, and this lines the uterine tubes, and that cilia will beat back and forth to push the egg toward the uterus. Simple epithelial tissue is a single layer of cells, whereas stratified has many layers. So this is the number of layers. Simple is a single layer, whereas stratified are many layers. The walls of the smallest blood vessels, which we call capillaries, are composed of simple squamous, and again, the reason for that is so that gas exchange can occur, diffusion can occur across that thin membrane. Simple cuboidal epithelial tissue lines the kidney tubules and the cavities of other internal organs, whereas stratified squamous, many layers of flattened cells, would line the nose, mouth, esophagus, anal canal, and vagina. And these are areas where you'd have a lot of abrasion, so you would want many layers of these cells so that as they're sloughed off, they can be replaced. These cells are also reinforced by a protein called keratin to help strengthen them. Pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue. Pseudo means false, so it looks like it's stratified or many layers, but it's really not. Each cell does touch the basement membrane. So if you look at this diagram here on the left, if we just look at the nuclei, it looks like we have 2 layers of cells. But really, each of these cells touches the basement membrane. Each one is attached to the basement membrane, so it's really just one layer. So pseudo-stratified. When an epithelium secretes a product, it is said to be glandular. So a gland can be a single epithelial cell, such as a goblet cell within columnar epithelium, or it can be made of many cells. So here in this photomicrograph, you can see the epithelial tissue. This is called the brush border. This is well, I'm not writing for some reason. This is called the brush border, and this is like the top of the tissue, because we're kind of looking at it sideways. And then these are the goblet cells that would do that secreting. Glands that secrete their product into ducts are called exocrine glands, and those that secrete their product directly into the bloodstream are called endocrine glands. The second major type of tissue is the connective tissue. And connective tissue is very diverse, so there's going to be lots of types of tissues and functions that we're going to see with this group. It can bind organs together, provide support, fill spaces, produce blood cells, and store fat. Generally, they are widely separated by space that is filled with a matrix. And matrix is a non-cellular material that varies in consistency from solid to jelly-like. So we'll see a little bit of a variation in how much space is between the cells, but most of them are going to have a lot of separation between them. You can see that in the diagram here. This is our cell, and this is a cell, and this is a cell, and this is a cell. So we have all of this blue space in between the cells that's filled with matrix. And matrix is made up of 2 parts, fibers and ground substance. The fibers can be of 3 different types. We can have collagen fibers. These are white and can contain the protein collagen, and they are used for flexibility and strength. We can have reticular fibers, which are very thin collagen fibers, and these are highly branched. It's reticulated, usually means branched or like a net pattern, and form delicate supporting networks. And then elastic fibers have more of a yellow appearance, and they have the protein elastin. They're not as strong as collagen fibers, but they can provide more elasticity, more stretch. Types of connective tissue. The first one is going to be areolar, also known as loose fibrous connective tissue. This supports epithelial tissue and many of the internal organs. It allows the organs of the lungs, arteries, and the urinary bladder to expand. It also performs a protective covering around muscles, blood vessels, and nerves. So you can see the cells themselves are these little purple circles. So you can imagine how much space there is in between there for the matrix. And then our elastic fibers, you can see them stretching across through here. So there's a lot of space in this tissue, and that's a good name, loose fibrous connective tissue. Dense fibrous connective tissue, on the other hand, contains many collagen fibers that are packed closely together. And this makes up a tendon, for example, which is connective tissue that connects muscle to bone. And it also forms ligaments, which is connective tissue that will connect bones to bones. So if you are looking at dense fibrous connective tissue in a lab, it may be labeled simply tendon. So just be aware of that. But this one's much more organized than the dense irregular, the areolar that we just saw. You can see how closely packed all of these structures are. Adipose is another form of connective tissue, and these cells store fat. So this is another word for fat. These cells are commonly called adipocytes, the individual cells. So this would be an adipocyte here. The body uses the stored fat for insulation, for energy, and for organ protection. Reticular connective tissue forms the supporting network of lymphoid tissue in lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, and in bone marrow. Reticular. And so we have these reticular fibers, which I mentioned were kind of branching, so you can see how they kind of just branch through this specimen. And then your individual cells are these little pink things here. Cartilage is another type of connective tissue. This forms the smooth surfaces that allow bones to slide against each other, so it's going to cushion. You don't have bone rubbing against bone. The cells in cartilage lie in small chambers called lacunae, which are separated by a solid, flexible matrix. So this is one cell here, and the nucleus of that cell is here. And they lie in these chambers called lacunae. And again, they're separated, like all connective tissue, by a matrix. Now, another word for a cartilage cell is a chondrocyte. Chond refers to cartilage and cyte refers to cell. And there are three types of cartilage that we're going to look at. The first one is called hyaline cartilage. This is found in the nose and at the end of long bones like your femur and at the ribs, and it forms the rings in the walls of respiratory passages. So there are rings in your trachea or in your windpipe that's made of hyaline cartilage. Also, the fetal skeleton is made of this type of cartilage, and later, of course, it's replaced by bone during development. So hyaline cartilage is the first type. The second one is elastic cartilage. Obviously, it would have more elastic fibers, and it makes it more flexible. So this is found in the pinna, which is the name for the outer ear. And finally, fibrocartilage. This has a matrix containing strong collagen fibers. It's found in areas where you're going to have a lot of tension and pressure, like the pads between your vertebrae. So those intervertebral discs that are made of cartilage or fibrocartilage in the backbone. Also the meniscus in the knee joint, areas where there's going to be a lot of movement and pressure. Bone is another example of connective tissue. And when I say bone, I don't mean a bone like your femur or your humerus, because those would be organs. We are talking about the tissues that make up those organs. So this is the most rigid connective tissue. The matrix contains inorganic salts, calcium, deposited around protein fibers. So this is why they say calcium is good for your bones, because the calcium is used to make up the bone tissue. A couple of types of bone tissue. First one is compact bone. This makes up the shaft of a long bone, like the long part of the long bone. It consists of cylindrical structural units called osteons. So this would be like an osteon. The central canal of each osteon is surrounded by rings of hard matrix. Bone cells are located in spaces called lacunae between the rings of matrix. In the central canal, the very center of the bone cell, nerve fibers carry impulses and blood vessels carry nutrients that allow the bone to renew itself. So there's a good nerve supply and a good blood supply to this bone tissue. Nutrients can reach all of the bone cells because they're actually connected in these tiny little canals called canaliculi that always reach the inside of the central canal. Spongy bone is the other type of bone. This contains a lot more space in it than the compact bone did. It is found in the ends of the long bones. It helps to lighten the skeletal system. And although it is light, it is still designed for strength, so it's still very strong. It just has more space in it. Another connective tissue, sometimes we don't think about it as being a tissue, is blood. But it is a tissue because it's made up of different cells working together. Blood creates interstitial fluid. This is the fluid found between the cells of the body. It transports nutrients and oxygen into the interstitial fluid, removing carbon dioxide and other waste. It distributes heat throughout the body, plays a role in fluid, ion, and pH balance, and various blood components protect us from disease. So like we have white blood cells, for example, inside our blood that would help work with our immune system. We also have thrombocytes or platelets inside our blood. Those are cells that work to clot to protect us from losing too much blood. And the matrix of blood has its own special name, and it's called plasma. Plasma is the liquid component of blood that represents about 55% of blood volume. Red blood cells we call erythrocytes, white blood cells, which we call leukocytes, and blood platelets, which we call thrombocytes, make up the other 45%. So again, it is a tissue because it's made up of several cells working together for common function. Red blood cells are small biconcave disc-shaped cells that do not have nuclei. So this is a normal red blood cell here. When we say it's biconcave, it's almost like a donut, but the hole is not all the way formed. It's like we squished it in the middle here on both sides, so biconcave. And this shape is very important to its function because you have a protein in blood called hemoglobin, and this is what gives the blood a red appearance that helps to carry oxygen from one place to another, which is one of the very important functions of your blood. If you have a misshapen red blood cell, such as individuals with the genetic disorder sickle cell anemia, then the proteins are misshapen and they can't carry oxygen as efficiently as they could if they were normal. White blood cells, these are larger than red blood cells. You can see several of them here in this diagram. There are a lot of different types. They do have nuclei, and they would appear clear, so we have to stain them in order to see them in the microscope. They will then appear a bluish purple color. White blood cells function to fight infection. Some are phagocytic, meaning they engulf pathogens. They take in the bacteria or the virus, they engulf it and digest it. And others are responsible for what we call adaptive immunity. And adaptive immunity is something that develops from being exposed to a pathogen previously, either in nature or through vaccination. Platelets are not complete cells, but are actually fragments of cells present only in bone marrow. When a blood vessel is damaged, the platelets will travel to that area and form a plug that seals the vessel. preventing blood loss from continuing. So they're involved in the clotting process. The third type of tissue that we're going to look at in this unit is that of muscular tissue. Muscle fibers are what we call the individual muscle cells, so it's called a muscle fiber. It contains both actin and myosin filaments. Those are protein filaments that work together to produce movement. Three types of muscular tissue. The first one is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is attached by tendons to the bones of the skeleton, and when it contracts, it causes body parts to move. So this is how you move consciously your body. Contraction of skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. So this type of muscular tissue is voluntary, and the fibers have dark and light bands that give it a striated appearance. So you can see here, this is a muscle fiber, and this is the nucleus of the muscle fiber, and you can see that there are these stripes that run across it. So it's a striated appearance, and it is under voluntary control. That's skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, does not have striations. They are spindle-shaped fibers, spindle-shaped cells, and each one has its own nucleus. Smooth muscle is involuntary. So this is found in, for example, your digestive system. You have smooth muscle in your esophagus, where wave-like contractions called peristalsis are going to move your food down your esophagus and into your stomach. Your stomach has smooth muscle. It churns on its own. You don't have to think about making your stomach digest your food. And all of these are involuntarily controlled, smooth muscle. The last type of muscular tissue is cardiac. Cardiac muscle is only found in one place in the body, and that is in the heart. It does have striations, and it is involuntary. Cardiac muscle cells are also characterized by branching, and they have intercalated discs which will bind one cell to the next. So to show you some of these characteristics on the diagram here, this is a nucleus you see in purple. This would be one muscle fiber there from one intercalated disc to the next. Okay, so these dark structures are your intercalated discs. And it does have striations. You can see stripes going across each of these fibers. The last type of connective tissue, the fourth type, is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue contains nerve cells called neurons, as well as supporting cells called glial cells. It's found in the brain and spinal cord, and a neuron has three main parts. There are the cell body, which we see in purple on this diagram, dendrites, which are these little branching structures that come out of the cell body, and then an axon. And the axon is actually all of this, okay? So the rest of it looks like a tail. So what happens is in the neuron, we have a nerve impulse that comes into the neuron through the dendrites, enters the cell body where we have the nucleus. Nucleus makes a decision on what to do with this impulse. The impulse then leaves the neuron through the axon. So it enters through the dendrites and exits through the axon. I remember axon is away from the cell body. Here are the definitions for those, for cell body and for dendrite and axon that we just discussed. Long axons are often covered in myelin. It's a white sheath fatty substance, and this helps to increase the speed of impulses. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the nervous system. In addition to neurons, nervous tissue contains glial cells called neuroglia. These are supporting cells. They help to nourish and support the neurons, and there can be four types: microglia, which engulf bacteria and debris. Astrocytes, which provide nutrients to the neurons. Oligodendrocytes form the myelin sheath in the brain, and then Schwann cells form the myelin sheath in the nerves outside of the brain. And that concludes our overview of the 4 types of tissues.